Is evolution a fact? Has it been proved? Can an intelligent person believe in creation and the God who is behind it? These are some of the questions we'll be taking a look at in this series of studies. But we welcome those of you who are here this evening, especially those of you who are visiting with us. The scheme that we're going to follow is this. Tonight, the subject is evolution is a fact. It is not a fact. It may be called a philosophy. It is not a fact. Tomorrow night, we shall look at the testimony of life, past and present, and consider what are put forth as the biological evidences of evolution. Friday night, we will ask the question, what do the fossils say? We will look at geology and paleontology. And then Saturday night, the lesson will be of apes and men. We will be in the field of anthropology. We will study about ape men, cavemen, prehistoric men. And we'll probably have more fun with that lesson than some of the rest. But I believe it's justified. You're going to be surprised when you hear the bright backgrounds of each one of the prehistoric men that have been put forward as supposedly links in the chain from the apes or common ancestor with the apes to man. And though we may have a bit of fun with that one, I'll make no apology for it. I think this is something that evolutionists in their very careless moments have coming. But tonight I want to first of all say that the quotations I'm going to give you, not every authority that I quote is going to be an evolutionist. I'm not going to quote the first creationist against evolution. And one reason I can do that is this, that for every facet of evolution there is, you can find an evolutionary expert who opposes that facet and says it's wrong and gives good reasons for not believing it. But he'll believe something else, and another evolution will take him to task for what he believes. And you can find, I believe, valid objections against every facet of the theory from evolutionists themselves, and yet, for some reason, and I think we'll be able to suggest some reasons this evening, they all agree that evolution has taken place. Some of them saying it is fact, that it is law, and looking down their noses at those who do not believe in evolution and who believe in a God who has created the heavens and the earth. And I also want to say in all of this that I am not against science. I appreciate science, not just because of its technology, which has given us some comforts in life. But I'm amazed how much science has changed since I was in college. One of the simplest things we could draw, and one of the first things we would draw in freshman biology, is the cell. You would have about three things to label: the nucleus, the protoplasm, and the cell wall, and that was it. But the cell now we know is infinitely more complex than that. What we have discovered in the cell, just since I was in college. What that means to me is the more we learn about the cell, the more we learn about life, the more we learn about this earth, every law that we come to understand about the functioning and how things go on, blind. We're coming to understand more and more about the majesty of God, more and more about His laws. Every law we come to discover, we are discovering more about God and more about His power and more about His knowledge. I am not against science. I am against a materialistic humanism that goes under the guise of science that calls itself evolution. An evolutionist, when he begins to be an apostle for evolution, and when he begins to evangelize, has gone beyond being a scientist. He has left the principles of science in doing that. For instance, this is what George Gaylord Simpson of Harvard University said, and for most of this century, he has been recognized as Mr. Evolution. He believes in evolution. There are no doubts in his mind about whether or not evolution is so, but about science and defining scientific things, he said this: it is inherent in any definition of science that statements that cannot be checked by observation, are not really about anything, or at the very least, they are not science. Observations, things that cannot be checked by observations, these are not science. The principles of evolution have not been checked by observation. They cannot be checked by observation. There is nothing to observe in relationship to them. And so when a scientist, and he may be, in every sense of the word, a scientist, but when he begins to evangelize on behalf of evolution, he is talking about something that he cannot give a demonstration of, that has not been checked by observation, and he is not acting as a scientist when he does that. So as we begin this evening, I will admit and say and assert that both the idea of creation and evolution are systems of faith. I have no qualms in saying that what I believe is a matter of faith. Creation is a one-time thing. Nobody was there before it happened to see it happen. It has not been repeated. I accept it by faith, and I believe there is sufficient evidence in life about us, in the fossil record, in the Bible that tells about it. I believe there is sufficient reason to believe in creation. In Hebrews the 11th chapter and verse 3, Paul said, by faith we understand that the worlds have been framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen are not made out of things which appear. That really is a profound statement. How did this obscure yet learned Jew know that what we see is really made of that which is invisible? How did he know something that would not be discovered until fairly recent times, that all matter is a form of energy, and it may be reduced to energy as we do in producing atomic power? And yet that's exactly what that verse asserts. And the word that is translated framed there means rendered complete. And so he says, by faith we understand that the worlds have been framed, rendered complete by the word of God. Then there's the 19th Psalm, verses 1 and 2, which says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. And the passage goes ahead to say that though there is no voice, day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. Through the course and the manner in which things go on, and through that which is made, and the laws we may see around us, we can see the effect of a designer and of a lawgiver. And though there is no voice there is speech that can be understood about a creator. In Romans the 1st chapter in verse 20, speaking of God, his everlasting power and divinity, Paul says, the invisible things of him, since the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that are made, even his everlasting power and divinity. Paul says that by looking at the things that are made, we perceive some invisible things about God, his everlasting power and divinity. The idea of creation, as far as I am concerned, is a matter of faith. I believe there is sufficient reason in nature to believe it. I believe it because there is a Bible that I believe a fair study of will convince an open-minded person that it is the Word of God. And I believe that Word of God tells me that there was a creation and that God, in the beginning, made the heavens and the earth. And so I accept that, and I accept it without shame. But at the same time, the theory of evolution is a matter of faith. It's a matter of faith in missing links. And you'll see somewhat of how many missing links there are in the whole realm of nature this evening. None of those links are there. The evolutionist believes they are there. He believes that there are links between all the living forms of life. He hasn't found one of them yet. But he believes they're there. He has faith that they existed, though he has never seen evidence of them. Evolution is a matter of faith. It is a matter of faith in a mechanism, an unknown mechanism, which can change one form of living creature into another form of living creature. There is no sufficient mechanism to explain how one kind of animal can turn into another kind of animal. It has not been discovered a principle by which that can take place. There are some theories, as we shall see, but there are evolutionists who deny those theories. So what you have then is faith in some principle, some mechanism that can change one form of life into another. And then they have faith in the ability of life to come from non-life. We've never seen that happen. If it didn't happen, nobody was there when it happened. It has never been repeated. They don't have any evidence of it. They cannot demonstrate it. They cannot check it by observation, and yet they believe it. That makes it a matter of faith. Both creation and evolution, then, are systems of faith. There's a great need to discuss this. I don't know if you understand how great the need is for us to study it, especially in regard to our young people. Without belaboring the subject, I want to read to you a statement from the Laidlaw Science textbook for the 5th grade, which Darrell had when he was in the 5th grade. That book was nearly 1/5 devoted to the evolutionary theory and advancing the theory. It had 266 pages, and 47 of these pages were devoted to advancing the theory of evolution. And here is one statement from it. How did life develop on Earth? Scientists do not know. Some think the development of amino acids and viruses led to early living things. Some think meteorites brought life from other planets. The early living things were probably one-celled organisms which lived in the water. There is no mention of God there. Where did life come from? No consideration of the idea that God might be responsible for it. They came from amino acids. Of course, that doesn't answer where the amino acids came from. They mention meteorites which bring life from other planets. That doesn't mention where the life on the other planets came from. But that's the assertion. That's taught to 5th graders. And when you get to high school and your science courses and your courses of sociology, you run into it more. And when you get into college, you run into it more and more and more, depending on what college you're in. Some of them aren't as bad as others. But the thinking of evolution pervades almost all of the subjects. Mathematics may be relatively free from it, but many of the other subjects are just pervaded with the idea and the theory of evolution. So there is the need to discuss it. Then there are just the claims on every hand that evolution is a fact. Since we lived here in the Bergen Record, there was a man who's associated with the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, who had an article in the Record, a letter to the editor, proclaiming what he called the law of evolution. I'm going to read to you another statement this evening when we get to it from somebody else from the American History or American Museum of Natural History, and you'll see that he certainly does not think that there is a law of evolution or that evolution is fact. I'll tell you something. When I started preparing for this series, it was with a certain amount of dread. It wasn't because I had any lack of evidence in the idea of creation, but it's because we have been bombarded so much in recent years with evolutionary thought that we almost get brainwashed and we think that everybody believes evolution. And what amazes me in this area where we're especially being bombarded with that kind of propaganda, what surprises me is that anybody believes in God anymore, that anybody believes in creation, and yet I'm surprised to find how many people do. But then as I continue to read and review my material and read other material to update the material that I already had, the thrill in me began to grow again as I saw how sure and how confident I could be in God and His power and His creation, and how weak, and I do not say this hastily, I'm not shooting from the hip. I'm not saying this off the cuff, whatever that means. I'm saying this by pure calculation, how weak the case for evolution is. It was thrilling to me to see all of that again, and I hope I can make it plain enough that you can know something of the essence of that by the time that we're finished with all of our discussions. Can scientists believe the Bible and reject evolution? These I quickly jotted down. There is Dr. A.E. Wilder Smith, who has 3 doctorates, no less, one from Oxford University, one from the University of Geneva, one from the University of Zurich. He is a professor and has been of pharmacology at the University of Illinois Medical Center in Chicago. He was commissioned by the United States government to establish a graduate school of pharmacy in Ankara, Turkey. He is now professor of pharmacology in Basel, Switzerland, and co-author of more than 50 technical publications. He believes in God, he believes in creation, and he rejects evolution. There's Dr. W.R. Thompson, world-famous biologist and former director of the Commonwealth Institution of Biological Control of Canada. He believes in God, and he believes in creation, and he rejects evolution. There's Dr. Melvin A. Cook, winner of the 1968 E.G. Murphy Award in Industrial Engineering and Chemistry, and winner of the Nobel Nitro Award. He believes in God, he believes in creation, he does not believe in evolution. There's Dr. Henry Morris, for 13 years, professor of hydraulic engineering, head of the civil engineering department at Virginia Polytechnic Institute. There's Dr. Walter Lamons, world-known geneticist and famous plant breeder. He believes in God, he believes in creation, he rejects evolution. There's Dr. Robert L. Whitelaw, professor of mechanical and nuclear engineering at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. And on the list could go, but these are some. Yes, a person can be a scientist of the highest order and believe in God and believe in creation and not believe in evolution. Why do you suppose there aren't more scientists saying they believe in God? Let me read to you a statement from the president of the Science Teachers Association of Texas. She said this: "To the teacher who denies the evidence of evolution, I can only say that either he lacks the ability of comprehension," that's tolerance, is it not? "Or he is deceiving himself and others. For me, this teacher has no place in the classroom," and that's the kind of control that those who believe in evolution are exerting over our society today. It is no wonder then that there are many scientists who just keep their mouths shut about it. And how many are there? No one knows. But in 1959, at the centennial celebration of Darwin in Chicago, E.C. Olson made this speech in the presence of all those scientists gathered there for that occasion. "There exists as well a generally silent group of students engaged in biological pursuits who tend to disagree with much of the current thought, but say and write little because they are not particularly interested, do not see that controversy over evolution is of any particular importance, and are so strongly in disagreement that it seems futile to undertake the monumental task of controverting the immense body of information and theory that exists in the formulation of modern thinking. It is, of course, difficult to judge the size and composition of this silent segment, but there is no doubt that the numbers are not inconsiderable." But that's not what the pedantic, ill-informed newspaper, media, representatives lead you to believe when they make their little broadcasts on television, or they write their little articles for the paper. And I suppose they expect to have scientists fall all over them for the commendations they give to them. We just do not get that impression from the articles that we read in the newspaper and the coverage that we see in the media. But the man that said this is an evolutionist, and he was speaking to a gathering of evolutionists in Chicago in 1959 to celebrate 100 years of Darwinian thought. The numbers, he said, are not inconsiderable. So there are many silent ones. There is a kind of new inquisition going on. It is not popular. One can lose his position and one can be threatened in a university if he does not believe in evolution. But according to this, there must be an underground many who do not still believe in evolution. Now when I talk about evolution, what am I talking about? There again will be the pompous evolutionist who says, well, you know, evolution is just change. And obviously there is change, so evolution must be so. And in the past, I have granted that, and I have said, okay, then there's this kind of evolution, and there's that kind of evolution, and then to my surprise in researching for this series of lessons, I come across evolutionists who do not call change evolution. But when they say evolution, they mean the same thing you mean when you say evolution. We're talking about Darwin's theory, where one kind of life turned into another kind of life, where one kind of animal, an alligator, for instance, turned in eventually to a bird. That's what she means by evolution, and she distinguishes that from simply being change. We believe in change. People are growing taller now than they have been in the past. I read a statement that believes that probably this generation of young people will reach the optimum, and we're not going to get any more taller, but it's better diet, maybe less work. I don't know what all has contributed to. Our youngsters growing taller now than they did in the past. American people are taller now than they were 200 years ago. That's change. The American does not yet have a distinct body form as some peoples on this earth do. But we're developing it, and they're supposing, for instance, that women are going to be taller and taller. They're going to be taller and they're going to be slenderer. Maybe that's where we're headed, maybe that's not where we're headed. But we are in the process of changing, developing a body type composed of all the genetic pool brought here from all the various peoples that came to the United States of America. That's change. When I'm talking about evolution tonight, I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about adaptation through natural selection. One of the evidences, supposedly, for evolution is the peppered moth in England. There was a preponderance of light-colored moths, and there were a few dark-colored moths. And they light on trees and they spread their wings. And before the Industrial Revolution, in the light color of the trees there, the light-colored moths were not seen easily by their predators, but the dark-colored moths were easily seen and picked off. And in 1850, there were more white moths vastly than the dark moths, but by 1895, with soot settling on the tree and other things falling out from the Industrial Revolution, there was a preponderance of dark moths, and the white moth was rare. Because now the white moth is on a dark tree, and his predators can pick him off, and evolutionists have said, here is change, and here is evidence of evolution and natural selection. Natural selection, yes, I would not argue with natural selection within limits. But here is that statement that I mentioned a moment ago, made by Marjorie Green, one of the world's leading philosophers of science. Listen closely about this that I've been speaking. Here, say the neo-Darwinian, is natural selection. That is, evolution actually going on. But to this we may answer selection, yes. The color of the moths or snails or mice is clearly controlled by visibility to predators. But evolution, see, she's asking, yes, there's change. You have a change from a preponderance of light-colored moths to dark-colored moths. But she says, is that evolution? Do these observations explain how in the first place there came to be any moths or snails or mice at all? By what right are we to extrapolate the pattern by which color or other such superficial characters are governed to the origin of the species, let alone the classes, orders, phyla of living organisms? She said, yes, that's change. Natural selection, yes. But evolution, no. And how can we look at any superficial change and suppose that that explains to us the very beginning of life and how one life form can develop into another life form? The statement, I remind you, was made by an evolutionist, but she's criticizing an evolutionist argument and some of the evidence that is put forward. So we're not talking about adaptation by natural selection. We're not talking about infertility, loss by isolation. You can take a group of birds and separate them and keep them apart and let them interbreed because they don't have the whole great big gene pool that they had before. The beaks on these may grow slimmer and the beaks on these may grow wider. The coloration might change a little bit here. The length of a tail might change a little bit there, almost imperceptibly. And then you put the birds back together and they have lost the ability to be interfertile. Or at least there is no interbreeding. The birds know the difference. A human being could hardly tell the difference, if at all, but they have been separated, and due to the habits they accrue being separated, they are no longer interfered. That is change. It is not evolution. And I do not care how long you let that go on, they're still going to be birds, and nothing is going to change them into anything else but birds. And so when we're talking about evolution, we're not talking then about infertility lost by isolation. Neither are we talking about selective breeding. Just look at the roses out here, and the roses that Matt brings in, the flowers that you grow. You can have pink roses, red roses, white roses. You can have tall rose bushes, short rose bushes. You can have floribundas, you can have tea roses, you can have grandifloras, you can have climbers. You can have roses with many petals, you can have roses with few petals. All of that is variation. And all of that is change. And all of that controlled by selective breeding. But it is not evolution. You could continue this selective breeding from now to the end of time, or take it back to the beginning of time, and all you would ever have is a rose. You might have some differences in roses because of the characteristics that you chose, but let me give you another example. There was a lengthy experiment carried on with sugar beets in France, began in 1800. They started with a sugar beet that had 6% sugar content, and they wanted to improve it. So they worked with it by selective breeding, and by 1878, 78 years later, they had increased the sugar content to 17%. And those who were associated with it then kept it going. Obviously another generation, and 40 years later, 140 years from the beginning of it, in 1918, it had not increased anymore. It had reached its optimum. But do you know that though it was 17% as opposed to 6% sugar content, it was still a beet? It had turned into a pineapple, and it never would turn into a pineapple. And if you stop the interbreeding, and if you stop the care by intelligence given to it, and just let it go, it would revert back to 6% sugar. And so yes, there is selective breeding, and it can bring about change, but it does not make a different form of life out of one kind of form of life. Selective breeding, that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about varieties that operate within bounds that have never been proved to have been crops. What are we talking about when we talk about evolution? We're talking about what is called the general theory of evolution. Now we're talking about the neo-Darwinian theory of chemical and biological evolution. And here's what that is. That over billions of years, starting back here 4 6/10 billion years ago, we have come from nothing to where we are now. They tell us that the earth is 4 6/10 billion years old. Now, I first came across that figure about 12 years ago. So really it's 4 6/10 billion and 12 years old. And it took it 2 million years of being a dead earth for amino acids to develop. And then it took 2 million years more to bring about the first protozoa, the one-cell forms of life. And then they began to develop, and finally to the Cambrian area, where there is just a whole outburst of all kinds of sophisticated life, and then up to the Cenozoic area where we are today. That's the theory of evolution that we are talking about. That's the one we believe is a matter of faith and is not proved. Where did this life first come from? Some say viruses. Other scientists say, no, that's impossible. A virus can only exist in the cell of a higher form of life. And the only way you can have viruses is already have higher forms of life, so obviously the higher forms of life did not come from the virus. Others say, as I've mentioned on the board, that life came from amino acids. Amino acids are formed from carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, exercised by some kind of energy. I remember one time in Alabama, in the home of some people, and they asked me, do you believe there's life on other planets? Now that's a question that I'll have to approach cautiously. And so I waited wisely for a second before answering, and there was a 13-year-old boy there, and he said, yes, I believe there's life on other planets. After all, those planets have the carbon and the hydrogen and the nitrogen and the oxygen, And they can form amino acids there just like they form amino acids here, and that's where life comes from. Well, this young man was attending church regularly. And somehow it hadn't dawned on him yet that there was any conflict between that which he had been so impressed with in school and his evolutionary science textbooks and the Bible that he was studying. And it may well be that his teacher was making evolution a lot more interesting than his Bible class teacher was, who may have done nothing more than simply ask questions out of a workbook and didn't study enough to make the class interesting, if that's a possibility. But as yet he hadn't seen the conflict. But if evolution were more interesting to him, as soon as he did see the conflict, what do you think would happen to him? Well, the question comes then, can life come from amino acids, and can amino acids just arbitrarily spring into existence by some charge of lightning or maybe heat from some ancient volcano? Here is the argument. Cells need, or it starts like this. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, the textbooks tell us, and they are. And cells need protein to grow and develop. Therefore, life develops spontaneously from spontaneously developed amino acids. Back here, the carbon and the hydrogen and the oxygen and the nitrogen, charged somehow, formed an amino acid. After a couple of million years, they formed protein in the process of that couple of million years, which finally built up a cell which was alive, which then developed all the rest of the forms of life. And don't say anymore that life began with an amoeba, or that puts you back into school when I was back in school. Now it's believed to be probably some form of algae, and not just any kind, but blue-green algae, no less, is what life began with after it finally got started from these amino acids after 2 billion years of the Earth being in existence. Well, let me parallel that argument. Here is the argument again. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Cells need protein to grow and develop. Therefore, life develops spontaneously from spontaneously developed amino acids. Try this. Bricks are the building blocks of walls. Houses need walls to grow and develop. Therefore, houses develop spontaneously from spontaneously developed bricks. Now, I suppose back there sometime in the ancient past, due to pressures and some kind of heat, something got formed into a cube, and the heat hardened it, and you had a spontaneously developed brick. And the bricks just got together and made a wall, and the walls just kept growing until you finally had a house. Now, one is just as good an argument as the other, but you say something is missing there, and you're right, something is missing. There is missing an intelligent guide to the energy that developed amino acids or the proteins or the cells. Just like we need a plan or a blueprint in building a house. And if you have a plan, you've got to have a planner. If you have intelligent guide to energy, you have to have someone possessing the intelligence. And when you have all of that, you have God. I believe it utterly reasonable to believe in God. You can't have a plan without a planner. You cannot have a blueprint without somebody who designed the blueprint. So there's the argument. It isn't proof. It certainly is not conclusive. That is the supposition. Here it is, that these molecules of hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen could get together under the right circumstances, and then they could form proteins. No intelligence in all of this at all, just accident. And they could form cells, which could develop life, which came from there to what we are today. Nothing guiding them. And we can take our smartest scientists today, with all this intelligence that we have developed over these millions and millions of years, and put them into their laboratories, and they are there today. And they can put together all of the chemical compositions of life. They can make an egg that will fool a chicken. but it won't hatch. It doesn't live. Why is that? With our intelligence, we cannot create life, but we suppose blind forces back here, unguided, accidentally created life. I don't believe that that will hold water. Then, as we look at protein and see whether that can bring life into existence, cemeteries and meat markets are full of protein, but they have never brought life into existence. Protein in and of itself does not form cells of living tissue. Does the evolutionist? Yes, has a faith. Faith in something unseen, undemonstrated, and unrepeatable. He believes that these amino acids formed by themselves. He believed that life spontaneously, by itself, sprang into existence. There is no way to repeat that. Even if the scientist can make and create life, if he ever does. All that shows is that it took intelligence to do that. That still doesn't prove that life can spring into existence spontaneously without the aid of intelligence. Well, didn't some scientists create life a few years ago? If you remember the Johnson administration, that's what some reporters said in the newspaper, and Johnson got busy and sent them a telegram congratulating them on their great accomplishment for creating life in the test tube. And they were rather embarrassed. They said no, they hadn't created life. They had taken the DNA of one virus and they had made another virus from it. And that was their admission, and that's what they did. What is DNA? DNA is our microscopic ladder-like spirals wherein is the code of life for activating the proteins and the amino acids, directing them to form the tissues of living beings or forms of life. They're in the genes. We've heard of the genes. DNA has been discovered since I was in college. But the fact is that the DNA of human beings can never produce a feature of a dog. The DNA of a cat can never produce a feature that is characteristic of an elephant. The DNA in cats only produce cat characters. The DNA in dogs only produce dog characters. The DNA in human beings only produce human being characters. I read an article in the New York Times, and this reporter was like one of so many. And he was saying that evolution has been proved because of DNA. All living things are related because they have DNA. But what he evidently did not know, and he conveyed his great ignorance, or else what he covered up and he conveyed his great dishonesty, is that the DNA is distinct in each living being. Here comes the DNA in the cells as the developing human being, and the DNA is a code, unchangeable code, and it says to this, you're going to be a hair. And he says to this, you go there and you make the hair flat so it'll be curly. And he says, you're going to be a part of an eye, get over there. And he says to another part, you're going to make that eye blue. And that's all decided. And it's not going to make a trunk if it is a human element of DNA. It's not going to make an element's trunk. Cannot, won't. For years, the evolutionists talked like the fossil record was his. And the creationists looked at that and they said, well, you're crazy. There are gaps in there. There are no missing links in there. There are no intermediate forms that you need to prove evolution. And now there are many evolutionists who recognize that, and they're trying to change the whole theory of evolution so that it is not as popularly understood in the past even evolution anymore. As we're going to see in this series of lessons, evolution is in turmoil. We'll especially look at that Friday night when we look at the fossil record. The fossil record belongs to the person who believes in creation. And you'll find that interesting Friday night. Likewise, DNA. The evolutionists talk today like DNA belongs to them. But the DNA belongs to the creationists because the Bible says everything shall produce after its own kind, and DNA being coded as it does makes sure that everything produces after its own kind. Just exactly what the Bible says that it should do. And when we talk about DNA being a code. You do not get codes from blind chance. We have fossils showing where waves have beat upon the shore that became hardened. Fossils of sea waves, in effect. You know, if you walk down on the seashore and you saw the little ripples in the sand, that's one thing. But if you saw John loves Mary, would you think that the sea waves did that? Accidentally? By chance? Blind force? Or would you think that intelligence had done that? And when you look at the DNA, it is a code. Just like a computer tape that tells the computer what to do or gives you the information you want from the computer, or controls something else over here and tells some other machinery what to do. What is on that tape is what comes out. And that's the way it is with DNA, a code. Or, for instance, if you were listening to the radio and you were hearing just static, but all of a sudden through the static it said dot, dot, did it, dot, dot, whatever the Morse code is, and you knew it, and you sat down and you wrote, the Russians are coming. Would you suppose that that was just accidental? Or would you suppose that there was somebody over there with intelligence sending you that code? There's no doubt as to how you would answer that question. And so where you have a code, you do not have accident. You have intelligence behind it. And if you've got DNA and it is a code, and it is, then you have intelligence behind that. Well, here is another fact. And this is astounding to a lot of people. I don't know why it should be, but I want you to listen. I've indicated it already a couple of times in this lesson. There is no record among the living or in the fossil forms of complex organisms arising from simple organisms. George Wills is a columnist I enjoy reading. But he decided to take a swipe at anti-evolutionists a few weeks ago. And he talked about some idiot that must have gone to the same school that the creationists went to. And he said it's absurd to reject evolution just because they haven't found the missing link. The missing link. You're going to see that there are 2 to 3 million missing links. There's a missing link between every life form. There's not a single link in any of the forms of life that have ever existed. You know the first one to recognize that? Well, I don't know if he was first or not, but Charles Darwin was there earlier. He said this: why then, and this is from his book, The Origin of the Species. I copied this from the Oxford Press, from the Harvard Classics, pages 178 and 179. They're different editions. So if you want to check that, this is from the Oxford Classics, Harvard Classics. In this chapter on the difficulties of the theory, he said this: these difficulties and objections may be classified under the following heads. First, why species have descended from other species by fine gradations. You have an alligator here, and he begins to draw on his legs and his scales. If an alligator has scales, we'll have to pick some other alfalfa, begin to fray and become more feathery through very, very slow changes, and eventually his body shape changes and he grows feathers, and his bones become hollow so they'll be light and he can fly. And all of that happened over millions and millions of years. Slow, slow steps. You know, if you can find alligators and you can find birds, and we're told by evolutionists that the closest relative to the birds today are the alligators, then you ought to find a lot of steps in between alligators and birds. And you can find birds and you can find alligators, but where are the steps? Darwin said, first, why species have descended from other species by fine gradations do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? Why is not all nature in confusion, instead of the species being as we see them well defined? So he said, among the living things, why don't we see everything in flux? Why is it that everything is precise and well defined? Why don't we see some creatures in the process of becoming other creatures, instead of seeing everything well defined? But then he looks at the fossil record and he says, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. We'll look at that last statement in just a moment. But he recognizes that the forms he needs to prove evolution, and they ought to be abundant and more abundant than the distinct life forms, he says they are not in the geological record. And he's exactly right about that. Let me read you 2 or 3 other statements here before I go on. This one. We cannot prove, he says, that a single species has changed. How many species are there? Well, scientists differ. Here's what Darwin said. There are 2 or 3 millions of species on the earth, but it must be said today, in spite of all the efforts of all the trained observers, not one change of one species into another is on record. One missing link, the missing link. He said 2 to 3 million species, and we cannot find a link between any of them. That means 2 to 3 million missing links. And yet we're expected to believe that evolution is a fact. We're expected to believe in the law of evolution. Now, the term species is a really indistinct term in scientists because there are groupers and splitters. The groupers try to put as many different varieties as they can of a species, and the splitters split up everything by just every little different characteristic they can find. But still, they can look at forms of life and see life forms well defined, not in confusion today, and they cannot find the intermediate forms that are necessary to prove evolution in the fossils. That's why I said a while ago, the fossil record belongs to the creationist. He doesn't find life beginning slowly and little and increasing. What he finds is a great burst of life right there, immediately. And life well-deformed and higher forms of life there, ready to go. Just as soon as we find life in the rocks, that's what we find. That's what you would expect to find if the story in the Bible is so. The evolutionist needs lower life forms, higher life forms, and all the intermediate steps in between, and the intermediate steps simply are not there. Darwin recognized that. Others have recognized that today. And then there is this statement made by about earlier. A man named Miles Eldridge of the American Museum of Natural History. And he said the old explanation that the fossil record was inadequate is in itself an inadequate explanation. We have studied rocks that if you line them up like the evolutionists wanted to line them up, would be 100 miles deep, full of fossils. But nowhere on the Earth's crust do you find it deeper than about 5 miles, in most places far less than that, which indicates that you really cannot take this whole column and stack it up in one column, but it must be interspersed. But at any rate, there is no shortage of fossils, billions of fossils, and yet we don't find the intermediate forms that evolution needs. And so this man from the Museum of Natural History in New York says that that explanation is inadequate. Then there's this statement that I copied out of Geology Today, which is an evolutionary source, and it was published in 1973. This statement. In the early days of the evolutionary theory, it was recognized that the fossil record could furnish the ideal proof of evolution, if it were not for the extensive gaps in the fossil record. But the fossil record is not complete enough because of the fossil record's lack of a precise, absolute time scale of any evidence regarding parent-daughter relationships. Now what that is that the bird came from the alligator is the parent, and the bird is the daughter. And this text says, Geology Today, he says, there is lacking any absolute time scale and any evidence regarding parent and daughter relationships. Paleontologists have not been able to add any appreciable detail to contemporary knowledge of how the evolutionary process works. In 1973, a book that deals with geology and paleontology just says the gaps are there, they are real, none of the intermediate forms have yet been found. not the first missing link. I hope I've made that plain enough. And I hope I made it clear and you understand what I'm saying. I know that in school, science teachers try to impress you with the fossil record and somehow indicates that it proves evolution, and it proves anything but evolution, and it is destructive to the concept of evolution that we have been discussing here. I want to read to you now some statements that I will duplicate later in the lesson. This is a statement by an astute scientist, G.A. Kerrick, Department of Physiology and Biochemistry at the University of Southampton. He has written an authoritative work. And let me see what it's called. It is in the International Series of Monographs in Pure and Applied Biology. His book is volume 4. And this is what he says in it. He's writing on evolution. He is an evolutionist. May I humbly state here, as part of my biological credo, that I believe the theory of evolution as presented by orthodox evolutionists is in many ways a satisfying explanation of some of the evidence. At the same time, I think that the attempt to explain all living forms in terms of evolution from a unique source, though a brave and valid attempt, is one that is premature and not satisfactorily supported by present-day evidence. This evolutionist just says it is not satisfactorily supported by present-day evidence. It may in fact be shown ultimately to be the correct explanation. But the supporting evidence remains to be discovered. We can, if we like, believe that such an evolutionary system has taken place, but I, for one, do not think that, quote, it has been proven beyond all reasonable doubt. Here is a man who is reviewing that book. And it was copied in the American Scientist, his review. What Kerrick does is take biology students there who are working on their doctorate, and one of the first things he asks them is, do you see any problems in evolution? Why, no, none of them. Not given the education they have had. And then he begins to nail them to the wall with the problems of evolution. And that's what he does in this book to his fellow evolutionists. So J.T. Bonner, writing in the American Scientist, said this. This is a book with a disturbing message. It points to some unseemly cracks in the foundations. One is disturbed because what is said gives us the uneasy feeling that we knew it for a long time down deep. But we're never willing to admit this even to ourselves. That explains a lot to me when I see these scientists asserting how evolution is a fact. It is another one of those cold and uncompromising situations where the naked truth and human nature travel in different directions. Here's what we want to believe, and here's what the pure naked truth is, and the evidence does not yet support the theory of evolution, the general theory of evolution, neo-Darwinian evolution. Really, the theory of evolution has changed since the time of Darwin. I'll go into that when we get into biology and some of these other lessons and get on some of this other material, so I won't have to leave it out tonight. But we can reduplicate that time after time after time of scientists who will make that statement. Well, let me kind of condense some of the rest of this so you don't have to wait too long this evening. Well, this thought. Much work in biochemistry today is involved with trying to find an explanation as to how evolution could have happened. But the only way we can tell it did happen, even if they could come up with an explanation, which they haven't, is to look at history. And history is found in the fossil record, and the fossil record does not give support to the theory of evolution. So evolution does not meet the scientific method. The scientific method would have the person, the scientist, identify his problem, gather his data, then form a hypothesis, and then empirically test it. There is no way to empirically test evolution, and every test that has been tried has not proven satisfactory. That's why we say evolution is a faith. It is not a science. It has not been proved, and is not measured up to the scientific method. It is a faith in missing empirical evidence. The empirical evidence simply is not there. Let me tell you about 3 significant meetings that have taken place in recent years. One was the Centennial meeting in 1959 in Chicago, celebrating the Darwinian Centennial. And Professor Dobzhansky spoke about how united the evolutionists were. But I read some things from that meeting that he must not have been listening to too closely. It was George Gaylord Simpson, Mr. Evolution again, who raised this possibility that the proof for evolution was not in yet, though he believes it. There were others there who made the statements, as we saw a while ago, that there is a minority, and it must not be inconsiderable, who do not accept the tenets of evolution. Both of those came out in this meeting. Then in 1966, at the Wistar Institute of Anatomy and Biology in Philadelphia, there was a meeting of some of the world's greatest scientists, and I want to read to you, I think, if I can find what it is I want to read to you, about what took place there. This is from the Philadelphia Bulletin. This is a rare display of honesty, and as I would look at it, objectivity. I'm sure the evolutionists would not look at this as objectivity, by a newspaper reporter. But from the Philadelphia Bulletin, April 1966, and I've got the date on another sheet of paper. I don't have the particular day here. Some 35 of the world's most renowned scientists argued to the point that they shed coats and loosened ties. When the battle was finished, Darwin's theory had been badly battered. Who was doing this? 35 of the world's top scientists. And yet your high school teachers, and your freshman biology teachers, and your sociology teachers will lead you to believe that evolution is something you can just take as axiomatic and as proven. But scientists failed to come up with a better one. By agreement at the beginning, there was no discussion of the influences of God or any form of supreme being. Well, I made this statement 10 years ago when discussing this, that in 100 years the theory of evolution would be gone. Now, I said also that these people are not going to believe in God, they're going to come up with another theory. A little bit later, I said 50 years from now, and Darwin's theory of evolution is going to be gone. Now, I'm not going to be a prophet, but I'll tell you, I think that probably within 25 years, maybe 10 years, Darwin's theory is going to be utterly repudiated. But they will come up with a different theory. And as I have prepared for this series of lessons, I have seen that evolutionists are indeed in turmoil, and there are those who are already throwing out Darwin before they come up with another theory. They just believe evolution happened. They do not have any idea how it happened. They just believe it happened quickly. One, Professor Goldschmidt from, I believe, the University of California, says that there were just hopeful monsters brought into existence by mutations quickly, and odd forms were born just immediately. He says, for instance, one day a reptile laid an egg and a bird hatched from it. Now that's what he said. From looking at the fossil record, something akin to that must have happened. Now this fellow's no dummy. And if you start reading what's going on in biology today, you're going to come across Professor Goldschmidt's name time and time and time again. Darwinism is being thrown out the window. But still they've got to cling to some kind of evolution. And that's one of the explanations that's being offered at this particular time. There were some other interesting things that came out of this meeting where these scientists argued. This is the name of that symposium. Mathematical Challenges to the Neo-Darwinian Interpretation of Evolution by 35 of the world's top scientists. These are the opening words by Sir Peter Medawar, who was chairman of the first session. There's pretty widespread dissatisfaction about what has come to be thought of as the accepted evolutionary theory in the English-speaking world, the so-called Neo-Darwinian theory. And you can see why I can prophesy the Neo-Darwinian theory. That's an old form of Darwin's theory. It's soon going to be out the window. It is under a great deal of fire today. But there's some other interesting things that happened at that meeting. It seemed to be the physicists and the mathematicians arrayed against the biologists. And the mathematicians made their objections. And I'm not going to go into all of those tonight. I don't have time. If you want to ask me about them or read the quotations I've got up here, I'll allow you. But this one incident I did find interesting. the mathematicians were showing that it takes really some 3 billion years to make the smallest changes according to the principles of neo-Darwinianism. Now the Earth is only 4.6 billion years, and life has only been going on 600,000 years, and yet they say it takes 3 billion years, using the computers they have access to now, to make the smallest change, if the changes are made that way. You can see the evolution from the very simple forms of life to mankind today simply did not have time to occur. Marcel P. Schutzenberger from the University of Paris, a mathematician, talked about his work with computers, using the iteration necessary to bring about the changes to come from the very small, simple forms of life to the complex. And he said this: we find that we have no chance. The computers of them, he says, it just jams. Thus, to conclude, we believe that there is a considerable gap in the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, and we believe the gap to be of such nature that it cannot be bridged within the current conception of biology. And you know what happened there as he continued to talk about his computers? Dr. Waddington, who was chairman of that session, said, we are interested in your computers. And as he tried to continue, the biologists heckled him. As somebody asked not long ago, where have the scientists gone? Why such advocacy? Where the objectivity? Where the open-mindedness? We had better say God help us, because the scientists are not going to help us. They are so wedded to some form of rejecting God and being humanists and being materialists. There is this other statement. I don't know if I've got time to spot it quickly or not. I do. I'm going to read this to you. This is Dr. Murray Eden, and he's talking about what the Darwinist depends upon in his mutations and random chance and natural selection, and the mathematical possibilities of that. He says, it is our contention that if random is given a serious and crucial interpretation from a probabilistic point of view, mathematical, the randomness postulate is highly implausible, and that an adequate scientific theory of evolution must await the discovery and elucidation of new natural laws, physical, chemical, and biological. He's saying that if we're going to believe evolution, we're going to have to wait for the discovery of new laws that we don't have now. He's saying we can disprove the old. They're not valid. Out goes neo-Darwinianism. We still believe in evolution, and we're waiting for new laws that can explain it to us. Now, my friends, that's faith. I said in the beginning that evolution was a faith. It was not a fact. It is not law, and it is not science. Well, how much more? Let me come to some conclusions then, and say this. Evolution is unproved, and it is in disarray today. It has a faith in forms of life never seen among the living or in the fossil record. It has a faith in the unrepeatable, in unproved occurrences such as spontaneous generation. And it is a faith and hope for discovery of yet undiscovered laws. Now that comes a long way from being something that is proved. And I ask your indulgence just for a final few quotations. This first from Niles Eldridge of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And this is from the Washington Post, August 8, 1981. And he said this: the current theory is for the most part consensus, not proof. It has been accepted largely because of the persuasiveness of a few highly talented biologists. This statement from H.H. Newman of the University of Chicago. Relevant as he may be to, or reluctant as he may be to admit it, honesty compels the evolutionist to admit that there is absolutely no proof of organic evolution. May I say that again? This is by an evolutionist. Reluctant as he may be to admit it, honesty compels the evolutionist to admit that there is absolutely no proof of biological or organic evolution. Then this statement, and one more, and we'll close this evening. This is from a professor of botany at Cambridge University, E.J.H. Corner. Well, listen closely. He's an evolutionist. Much evidence can be adduced in favor of the theory of evolution from biology, biogeography, and paleontology, though it is now being denied that you find it in paleontology. That's the fossil record. But I still think that to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favor of special creation. That's why he said the evidence is. It's in favor, as far as plants are concerned, of special creation. Then one of the more significant things that's taken place is this. While American scientists are clinging to the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, European scientists are throwing it out the window, or have thrown it out the window, especially the French scientists. Here is a statement, or there is a statement, from Pierre P. Grosset, one of the most distinguished of all French scientists. He's recently published a book. I'm not going to pronounce it in French. In English it would be The Evolution of Life. And in it he attacks every facet of the theory of evolution. Professor Dobzhansky, who is an evolutionist of the neo-Darwinian order, reviewing the book, says this: the book of Pierre P. Grosset is a frontal attack on all kinds of Darwinism. Its purpose is to destroy the myth of evolution as a simple, understood, and explained phenomenon, and to show that evolution is a mystery about which little is perhaps and can be known. Now one can disagree with Grosset, but not ignore him. He is the editor of the 28 volumes of The Traits of Zoology, author of numerous original investigations, and ex-president of the Academy of Sciences. His knowledge of the living world is encyclopedic. The closing sentence of Grosset's book is most interesting and disturbing to Dobzhansky. In that sentence, Grosset says, the closing sentence of his book, where he attacks every facet of the theory of evolution, it is possible that in this domain biology, yields the floor to metaphysics, or to a non-natural, supernatural explanation of origins. That's from France's top scientists. You do not have to believe in evolution. Your teachers may, and you young people may find that they may ridicule you, they may make it uncomfortable for you, but you can know now that they're the uninformed ones. And you heard it here, in a church where they believe the Bible, that 25 years from now, maybe 10 years from now, the old Darwinian theory of evolution is not going to be believed. They'll replace it with something else. But it's dying, and soon going to be dead. And your teacher in school is going to have to change what he's teaching. In our services, we want to do all that we do to the glory of God. And sometimes there are those who won't obey the gospel and be saved from their sins. And if you would come to the Lord tonight and obey the gospel and be baptized, we invite you to come. All together we stand and sing.
Sinner, Jesus will receive, Son is word of grace to all who love every path believe. All will linger, all will fall, singing Christ is Jesus,
Tonight's lesson was somewhat detailed. The other lessons ought to flow more easily and be involving more interesting material. This was introductory tonight, but I thought it necessary to establish, first of all, that we're dealing with a philosophy and really not something that has been basically proved in science. We want to give those who have questions opportunities to ask them, but we're going to do it after the service and just ask them to come down front. Anybody who wants to participate in questions or just listen, you feel free to come down. We do this for a couple of reasons. One is because there are some principles that guide us in our assemblies that we don't want to violate. And then, too, those who need to leave or want to leave can go ahead and leave. So after the closing prayer, there are matters you want to discuss or points you want to make, questions you want to ask. Come down to the front, and anybody who wants to sit in on such, you feel free to come down too. I think you have some announcements here.